looking at external funding and how it can support business performance. I'm joined by James Edwards, who's a senior fund manager with the Finance Southeast Group. James has many years' experience with organisations like Lloyds TSB and now works with FSE developing their SME portfolio. James, 12 months into the pandemic and businesses are plugging holes or looking at growth, how do you suggest MDs determine whether external funding is right for them?
Well, that's a very good question. I think MDs really do need to understand whether they actually want or need funding in the first place. They need to develop their business strategy. If they haven't got a strategy, then they should certainly get one and possibly need help to do that. They need to examine the options, really. Look at internal and external sources of funding and decide on what their plan is. For external funding, they need to accept that plan will be shared by third parties, or two third parties rather, and who have to buy into it. Companies need to go along with the idea that they'll be subject to a fair amount of due diligence by those external funders, and to accept the terms of what that funding might come up with at the end, assuming they get an offer. Although obviously people should negotiate, which is a key thing. And also, I suppose, depending on the nature of the funding and the funder involved, then they may want some ongoing involvement, support to the business and provide input. So I think, people need to accept that as well as a potential part of the deal.
And thinking of the future, how do they determine how much money they might want and what they'll use it for?
Well, this should really sort of fall out of the plan, to be honest. The amount should reflect on what the spending intentions are for the business, and people should be prepared to justify these to funders at the end of the day. They need to decide on what their time horizon is, so they probably don't need all the cash in one go, unless they're looking to fund an acquisition or a big item of capital expenditure or something like that. And then they should really consider how they can meet the costs of the funding that they're going to take on. And this largely reflects or influences the nature of what that funding might be, whether it's borrowing a loan or something like that, or taking on equity. Okay,
makes sense. And I guess if you're going to make that decision, what are the options for funding?
Well, two main big areas to think about, really. Internally generated funds. So that's from the business's own profitable trading, all being well, cash generation. You can fund from that. You can free up cash from an underutilized asset, possibly in the business, or the owner or the owners can put up money into to support the business themselves. So that's internal sources. Externally, there's sort of three main areas really. So there's borrowing, debt, finance, many sources of that. Traditional banks, new alternative funders that come on the scene in recent years, possibly the government in the current climate. There's equity, as we've alluded to before, so that can come via high net worth angel type investors that people sort of see on the television, private funds, crowdfunding, which is a popular online source now, possibly venture capital for larger amounts, and potentially grants as well. There's been a lot of grant type support for businesses in the current environment. If a business is very R&D intensive, then there's good sources of support for that potentially, or if they're in a certain location, there may be some grants available to support a business setting up or expanding there. And in terms of how much they can raise, well, that depends on a number of factors really. It depends on the size of the business, what their expectations are, what their projections looking like, how much can they support in terms of generating revenue, covering interest with cash and all that sort of stuff. If it's borrowing, the type of funder they're looking at going to, their appetite for supporting you, nature of the business cycle, all those sort of things, really.
And lending is obviously a very crowded industry. How would you suggest an MD finds the right lending partner? How do they choose?
Well, there's an awful lot of people to choose from out there in the market. Yes, and I think it's always helpful if you can get a soft introduction from somebody, really, because that does help really, because people know people, and people want to work with people they like at the end of the day in all aspects of business. So I think that's important if you can get a good introduction, look at a range of people and see what you want from that relationship as well, really. Because say if you want to If you want a hands-on relationship, like sort of things I've alluded to from possibly an equity investor, then that's a consideration. If you're looking at more hands-off relationship and you can run the show yourself and you don't need involvement in terms of, an investor that's going to take a share in your company, you can fund it all through debt, then possibly a more distant relationship from a lender. But there's hybrid models, in between those, really.
Okay, no, thanks. And I guess one of the key things about borrowing is you've got to pay it back. So in a couple of seconds, what's the most important factor as a lender you look at when determining whether to lend?
Well, as you'd expect, there's a whole gamut of things we do look at in every respect. But at the end of the day, it's all about the management team, because you're backing them. You need a good team, a strong team, hopefully with most bases of the business covered, most disciplines. You won't always get that, admittedly, but a good management team can transform a business, and that's really what you want to support at the end of the day, I think.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me today. Thanks to everybody who's watching. For other videos and tips on revenue growth and lead generation or revenue generation, have a look at my YouTube channel or look at my website, www.revenuework.co.uk. Until next time, let's keep on growing. James.